The cold was the first thing she knew, and the last thing she felt each day. It wasn't the clean, crisp cold of a winter morning in the country. It was a damp, sneaking chill that rose from the wet asphalt and clung to her bones like a second skin. It lived in the alleyways, shadowed and narrow, smelling of old trash and wet cardboard. For the little girl, these alleys were the corridors of her world. She was 7 years old, though she didn't know it for a fact. And she moved through these corridors like a small, quiet ghost. Her shoes, once someone's best Sunday pair, were now soft and flimsy. The soles worn so thin she could feel the texture of the ground beneath her feet. Gritty here, a patch of icy slime there. Each step was a small lesson in discomfort. Her day began before the sun had even thought about coloring the sky gray. The city would still be breathing deeply, its giant buildings asleep, streets mostly empty except for the rumbling of the first trash trucks. She would find a dry spot under a restaurant's exhaust fan, where the air was a few degrees warmer, and pull her thin jacket tighter around her. The jacket was a faded blue, with a broken zipper she held together with a small, greasy string. It was more a memory of warmth than a source of it. She would watch the steam plume from the metal pipe and pretend it was the breath of a friendly dragon, keeping her safe until the light came. She knew the city's secrets. She knew which bakeries tossed their unsold day-old bread at precisely 6:15 a.m., and which were careful to lock their bins. She knew the park bench where the old man left half a sandwich for the pigeons, which she could usually snag before the birds grew brave. She knew the sound of a kindness, a soft word, shared glance, and the sound of a threat, a harsh shout, the quick stomp of a boot. She had learned to be invisible, to melt into doorways and brick walls, to make her eyes empty so people would look past her. It was a skill, and like any skill, it had taken practice. But today the practice wasn't paying off. The bakery bin was locked tight. The old man at the park never showed. The day wore on, and the hollow feeling inside her grew from a dull, familiar ache into a sharp, demanding pain. It was a pain that made her hands tremble and her vision blur sometimes. She tried drinking from a public fountain, but the cold water just seemed to anger her stomach, making it cramp and gurgle with a new ferocity. By late afternoon, as the sky began to turn the color of a bruise, she felt a desperate, creeping panic. This was worse than the usual hunger. This felt like an ending, and so her feet carried her, as they always did, to the place she called the window.
Ow.
It was the large, steamy front window of an Italian restaurant called La Trattoria D'Angelo, a name she knew only because she'd seen it on the menus people sometimes dropped nearby. It was her favorite place in the whole world, and the place that caused her the most pain. From her spot across the street, nestled in the shallow alcove of a closed-up shop, she could see everything inside. The world was golden. It was a world of warm light, laughter, and the most wonderful smells in the universe. Garlic, baking bread, roasting meats, and something sweet that she could never quite identify. It was the smell of belonging, of family, of care. She would press her forehead against the cold glass of her own alcove, her breath making a small foggy patch, and just watch. She watched the waiters in their white aprons moving with purpose, balancing plates that looked like mountains of food. She watched the families leaning close together, their faces lit by candlelight, their hands gesturing as they talked. She watched a man laugh so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes, and a woman feed a small piece of pasta to a baby in a high chair. These moments were both a comfort and a torture. They showed her that such warmth and happiness existed in the world, which was a comfort. But they also showed her a world that was completely sealed off from her, which was a torture. The glass window was a barrier more solid than any wall. It was thin enough to see through, to hear the muffled sounds of joy, to almost feel the heat. But it was absolutely unpassable. But it wasn't just the food or the laughter that held her attention. Tucked away in a far corner of the restaurant, partially obscured by a large potted plant, was a shiny black grand piano. To her, it was the most beautiful and mysterious thing in the world. It was a giant, sleeping beast made of polished wood and ivory. During the day, it just sat there. But sometimes in the evenings, a man would come and sit on the padded bench. His fingers, long and sure, would dance across the black and white keys, and music would fill the room. The music was different from the sounds of the city. The city's sounds were horns and shouts and the screech of tires. The music from the piano was like running water, like a story told without any words. It could be fast and happy, making her toes tap inside her worn-out shoes. Or it could be slow and sad, echoing the lonely feeling that lived deep inside her chest. She didn't know how to read music, and she had never been taught to play. But her mother, before she got too sick and had to go away, used to hum melodies. Simple little tunes that seemed to float in the air of their tiny apartment. The little girl remembered those tunes. She held on to them like treasures. Sometimes when she was alone in the alley, she would find a piece of cardboard and pretend it was a keyboard. Her small fingers, grimy and with chipped nails, would press down on the imaginary keys, and in her head she would hear the music. She would add to the old melodies her mother hummed, weaving in new sounds she heard in the city: a bird's cry, the rhythm of a passing train, the wail of a distant siren. In her head, she could make them all fit together. The music in her mind was the one thing that was truly hers. The one thing the cold and the hunger couldn't touch. Tonight, as she watched the scene inside the restaurant, the pain in her stomach was so bad it made it hard to focus on the piano. The smells of garlic and tomato sauce were a physical assault. Every laugh from inside felt like a poke at her own empty life. A young woman at a table near the window took a large bite of a cheesy breadstick. The little girl's mouth watered painfully. She swallowed hard, but there was nothing in her throat. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible to will the pain away. But it wouldn't go away. It was getting worse, a deep, grinding emptiness that felt like it was consuming her from the inside out. The usual ache was a friend she knew. This was a monster. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The quiet, observant ghost of a girl felt a flicker of something else. It was a tiny, reckless spark of an idea. It was born of desperation, so wild and audacious that it almost made her laugh out loud. She thought of the piano. She thought of the music in her head. She thought of the mountain of food on every plate. And the idea began to take shape, fragile and terrifying, but undeniably there. They had food. She had music. What if she could trade? The thought was so insane it felt dangerous. They would laugh at her. They would shout at her to get out. They would look at her dirty clothes and her thin face and see nothing but a beggar. But the monster in her stomach clawed at her, a sharp, gnawing reminder that doing nothing was no longer an option. The pain was a choice changer. The flicker of an idea started to glow a little brighter, pushing back against the fear. She looked from the laughing faces to the silent, beautiful piano in the corner, and a single tear tracked its way through the grime on her cheek. She was still just a little girl, cold and hungry, looking through a window. But for the first time, she was thinking not just about watching, but about asking. The idea, once born, was a terrifying thing to carry. It felt heavy in her chest, heavier than the hunger itself. For a long time, she just stayed in her spot, watching the restaurant, her mind wrestling with the monster in her belly and the wild new thought that was trying to take flight. It was a crazy idea, the kind of idea you only had when you had nothing left to lose. And she had nothing left to lose. Her body was cold, her stomach was a cavern of pain, and the loneliness felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Maybe, she thought, maybe being laughed at and thrown out wouldn't be so much worse than this. Taking a deep breath that felt more like a shudder, she pushed herself up from the cold ground. Her legs felt shaky, like they might not hold her. She looked both ways down the street, a habit learned long ago for safety, and then she crossed. The pavement on the other side felt different. It was the territory of the warm people, the people with full bellies. Each step she took towards the heavy wooden door felt like a giant leap. She could hear the sounds more clearly now, the clinking of silverware on plates, the low hum of dozens of conversations, the occasional burst of loud laughter. The delicious smells grew stronger, wrapping around her like a warm blanket that she was not allowed to wear. She reached the door. It was a dark, solid piece of wood with a fancy brass handle. It looked like the door to a castle, She could see her own faint reflection in the polished brasa, small, dark smudge of a girl with enormous, fearful eyes. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a little bird was trying to get out of her chest. For a second, she almost turned and ran back to the safety of her cold alley. But then the pain in her stomach twisted itself into a tight knot, a painful reminder of why she was here. She couldn't go back. Not empty-handed. She placed her grimy hand on the cool metal of the handle and pushed. The door was heavier than she expected, but it swung open with a soft, welcoming chime that sounded entirely too cheerful for the occasion. A wall of warm, noisy air hit her face, so different from the chill of the street. It was air filled with life, with conversations and the smells of dinner. And just as suddenly as the door opened, everything inside seemed to stop. It was like a movie that had been paused. The chime of the bell had announced her arrival, and every head, it seemed, turned to look. The low hum of voices vanished. A waiter stopped mid-stride, a tray of breadsticks held aloft. Conversations died on people's lips. All eyes, dozens of them, were fixed on her. She stood frozen in the doorway, a small, out-of-place figure against the backdrop of warmth and light. She felt their stares like tiny, sharp needles on her skin. She could feel her thin jacket, her dirty shoes, her tangled hair. In that moment, she was acutely aware of every single way she did not belong. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. A man in a sharp black suit, his hair perfectly styled and his tie knotted without a single wrinkle, started walking towards her. This was the Mater D, the gatekeeper of this warm world. His face was not angry, but it was hard and professional. It was the face of a man who dealt with problems, and she was clearly a problem. He moved with a swift, gliding motion that was meant to intimidate. He was already reaching out, not to help her, but to guide her back to the door from which she had come. "You cannot be in here," he said, his voice low and firm. It wasn't a shout, but it was more powerful. It was the voice of someone who is used to being obeyed. His hand was about to close around her thin arm. The little girl looked past him, her eyes scanning the room full of staring, silent people. She saw their faces a mix of surprise, annoyance, and pity. She saw the full plates, the half-full glasses of wine, the relaxed smiles that had now been replaced by frowns. Her throat was dry and tight, but she knew she had to say the words. The monster in her stomach was roaring now, demanding she try. She had to try. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was so small, it was almost lost in the silence of the room. She cleared her throat and tried again, a little louder this time. "Please." The Mater D paused, his hand hovering in the air. He looked down at her, his expression softening just a fraction, from annoyance to impatience. "Yes?" he asked, as if expecting a plea for money. She took a shaky breath and forced the words out. One by one, her eyes fixed on the grand piano sitting in the corner. "Can I play a song?" "On the piano?" She had to take another breath, the air catching in her throat. "For something to eat?" The words hung in the air, fragile and absurd. For a beat, there was only silence. The people in the restaurant stared at this tiny, desperate child who had just proposed the most ridiculous trade, a beggar who wanted to be an entertainer. It was so out of place, so unexpected, that it didn't quite compute. Then, the man sitting at a large table near the front let out a short, sharp laugh. He was dressed in an expensive-looking suit, his face red from wine and good company. He nudged his friend, who was sitting beside him, and repeated the girl's request. "Did you hear that? Play for food." He chuckled, his voice echoing in the quiet room. His friend's lips twitched, and then he chuckled too. That was all it took. The chuckles spread like a crack in ice. Another table joined in, a polite, incredulous laugh. Soon, the entire restaurant was filled with a wave of genuine, booming laughter. It wasn't a cruel laughter? Not really. It was the laughter of people who were hearing something so unbelievable, so far outside their normal experience, that they can't help but find it funny. To them, it was a joke. A little street urchin, offering to play the grand piano for a plate of spaghetti. The idea was hilarious. The laughter washed over the little girl, hot and suffocating. It was worse than the cold. It made her feel small and foolishly small. Her cheeks, which were already dirty, began to burn with shame. She felt her chin start to wobble and her eyes fill with hot, stinging tears. She had been right. It was a crazy idea. The monster in her stomach had led her here to be mocked. She wanted to disappear, to melt back into the doorway and run away into the dark, cold night where she belonged. The Mater D was looking at the laughing crowd with embarrassment, and he finally took hold of her arm. His grip was not rough, but it was firm and final. He began to lead her toward the door, his back straight, as if to restore some order to the situation. She could feel the tears begin to spill over, tracking hot lines down her cold cheeks. The laughter followed her like a cruel soundtrack, each laugh a confirmation of her failure. She had failed. She had nothing. She was nothing. Just as her hand touched the cool metal of the door handle again, "It's time from the inside," a voice cut through the noise. It was not a loud voice, but it was strong and carried a strange weight that made people stop. It was an old voice, a little gravelly, as if it had been used for telling stories for a very long time. Let the child play. The laughter didn't just stop. It was cut off, as if by a knife. Every head in the room, including the Mater Ds, turned toward the source of the voice. It was an old man sitting alone at a small table for two, tucked away near the back. He was dressed in a simple but clean tweed jacket, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles. His hair was thin and white, and he wore spectacles perched low on his nose. But it was his eyes that held everyone's attention. They were sharp, intelligent, and not at all amused. They were looking not at the Mater D, but past him, directly at the little girl. The Mater D stood frozen for a moment, his hand still on the girl's arm. He was caught between the rules of his restaurant and the authority of a very important, long-time customer. The old man held his gaze, then gave a single, firm nod. It was a nod that said, "I am not asking." With a barely perceptible sigh of frustration, the Mater D let go of her arm. He stepped back, gesturing towards the piano with a sharp, almost dismissive flick of his hand. His face was a mask of strained professionalism. He was allowing this, but he was not happy about it. It was written all over his face. "Fine, you can have your joke. But when this little spectacle fails, don't blame me." The little girl stood there. Her tears paused, her heart thumping wildly. She looked from the stern Mater D to the old man who had saved her from the door. The old man gave her a small, almost invisible nod of encouragement. He was the only person in the whole room who didn't look like he was waiting for a disaster. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to walk toward the piano. The path across the restaurant felt like the longest walk of her life. The silence that had replaced the laughter was just as bad. It was a heavy, waiting silence, full of doubt and expectation. She could feel every single pair of eyes on her back, watching to see what this silly little beggar girl would do. She could hear her own small footsteps on the carpet, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She finally reached the piano. It was even more beautiful up close, a gleaming black monster that seemed to hum with a quiet power. The bench was too high for her. A young waiter who looked no older than a teenager rushed over. Without a word, he knelt down and offered her his linked hands as a step. She looked at him, startled, and he gave her a quick, shy smile. She put her foot on his hands, and he hoisted her up onto the bench. She sat there, her small legs dangling far above the floor. For a moment, she just looked at the keys. The black and white ivory seemed to stretch out forever, a foreign landscape. The room was poised. She could feel their collective skepticism, their readiness to laugh again. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out their stares. She took one last shaky breath, ignoring the pain in her stomach and the burning in her cheeks. She didn't think about the people or the food or the laughter. She only thought about the music in her head, the melodies her mother had hummed, the stories she had woven together in the cold alley. She let them fill her, pushing out the fear. Then her small, trembling fingers found their place on the cool, smooth keys, and she touched them. Asterisk, the first sound that came out was not a song. It was a single, clear note that hung in the air like a drop of clean water in a dusty room. It was a C, maybe, or a note whose name she would never know, but it was pure. It was perfectly struck, without a hint of the clumsiness or the hesitant, fumbling sound everyone had expected. That one note played with a strange and quiet confidence. It's enough to make the waiter who had helped her onto the bench stop halfway back to the kitchen. It made the mater d', who was already turning to console the old man for the disturbance, freeze in his tracks. That single note was a statement, and then came the next. And the next her fingers, which had seemed so small and dirty before, now moved with a purpose that was almost eerie. They did not stumble or hesitate. They seemed to know exactly where they were going. The sound that followed was a melody, but it was like no melody they had ever heard from a child. It was simple at first, a delicate and hopeful tune that sounded like a bird singing its first song at dawn. It was the melody her mother used to hum, but it was clearer now, more defined. It rose and fell with a gentle grace that seemed to bring the very air in the room to life. The initial skeptical silence of the restaurant deepened into something else. It became a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. The people who had been ready to laugh, to exchange knowing glances about the sad little spectacle, now found themselves leaning forward in their seats. The woman who had been feeding the baby in the high chair stopped, a tiny piece of cheese halfway to the baby's mouth. Her husband, who had been scrolling through his phone, lowered it slowly, his eyes wide. The table of businessmen, who had been the first to laugh, now stared with their mouths slightly open. The man who had nudged his friend and chuckled now looked as if he had seen a ghost. The joke wasn't funny anymore. In fact, it was beginning to feel like they were the ones who were foolish. The little girl's world had shrunk. It no longer included the staring people, the warm lights, or the smell of food. Her world was now the 88 keys beneath her fingers. Her body, which had been a bundle of aches and shivers, seemed to be powered by something else entirely. It was as if the music was flowing through her, and she was just the vessel that let it out. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was just feeling them. Each press of a key was a release of the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the shame of the laughter. It was all pouring out of her fingertips and into the piano, where the instrument, with its wooden heart and steel strings, transformed it into something beautiful. The simple melody began to change. It grew more complex, more intricate. A new layer of harmony joined the tune, a sad, minor key counterpoint that spoke of long, cold nights and empty stomachs. It was the sound of her own quiet suffering, woven into the fabric of the hope. The two melodies danced together, one reaching for the light, the other remembering the darkness. It was a story, a conversation, a fight, and a reconciliation, all happening at once. A soft gasp went through the room. This wasn't just a kid playing a tune. This was something profound. An elderly woman, her silver hair arranged in an elegant bun, slowly brought a handkerchief up to her eyes. She wasn't wiping away a tear. She was just holding it there, as if to brace herself against the wave of emotion coming from the piano. She had once been a concert pianist herself many years ago, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not a skill you could learn. This was a gift. This was the kind of raw, unpolished genius that appeared once in a generation. The music swelled. It grew louder, more confident. The sad little melody was no longer hiding in the background. It was rising up, meeting the hopeful tune head-on. The sound filled every corner of the restaurant. It wrapped around the tables, past the bar, and all the way to the kitchen, where the clatter of pots and pans had fallen silent. The chef, a large, gruff man with a tattoo of a knife on his forearm, had poked his head out of the kitchen door at the sound of the first note, expecting to have to shoo someone away. Now he stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression one of utter bewilderment. He had heard a lot of music in his life, but he had never heard anything like this. The notes now came faster, a torrent of sound that was both wild and perfectly controlled. It was the sound of a city street, with its honking horns and rushing trains, but it was also the sound of a single, solitary heart beating against it all. It was the sound of chaos and the sound of peace, all happening at the same time. Her hands were a blur, flying across the keys, her whole body now swaying with the rhythm. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back slightly, lost in a world that only she could hear. The mater d', the man who had been so ready to throw her out, stood rooted to the spot near the door. His face was a canvas of shifting emotions, disbelief, awe, and a slowly dawning sense of shame. He had seen this girl as a problem, a piece of dirt to be swept off the pristine floor of his restaurant. He had been annoyed by her, embarrassed by her. He had looked at her and seen only what was on the outside: the dirty clothes, the thin frame, the audacity of her request. And now this same problem was creating a moment of pure magic in the middle of his dining room. A moment more beautiful and real than anything he had ever orchestrated with his fancy wine lists and perfectly placed tables. He felt a knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. He had almost sent this away. He had almost silenced this. The piece of music reached its peak. It was a storm of sound, a powerful, emotional crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old building. It was every feeling she had ever had, all released at once. It was the pain of hunger, the sting of cold, the ache of loneliness, and the desperate burning fire of hope. It was so powerful, so full of raw truth that it hurt to listen to. It was beautiful, but it was a painful kind of beautiful. Like looking at a star that is a million miles away and knowing you can never touch it. Several people in the restaurant were openly crying now, not even trying to hide it. The sound was just too honest. It bypassed all their defenses and went straight to their hearts. And then, as quickly as it had risen, the storm began to fade. The torrent of notes softened, the complexity simplified. The two melodies, the hopeful one and the sad one, came back together. But this time, they were not fighting. They were intertwined, woven into a single, simple, heartbreaking tune. It was the sound of acceptance, of peace. It was the sound of a little girl who had found her voice for a few precious minutes and was now letting it go. The final notes were soft and slow, like falling embers from a fire. Each one hung in the silent air for a moment before disappearing. She played one last, lingering chord. It was a quiet, full sound that seemed to ask a question. And then she lifted her small hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. The silence that followed was different from any silence before it. It was not the silence of waiting or the silence of shock. It was a sacred, respectful silence, the kind you find in a great cathedral or a quiet forest at dawn. It was a silence filled with the echo of the music, a silence so heavy with emotion that no one wanted to be the first to break it. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there in the warm, golden light, the spell of the music still holding them captive. The little girl on the piano bench opened her eyes. The world slowly came back into focus. The staring faces, the candlelight, the smell of garlic and bread. She felt a single tear slide down her cheek, and then another. She looked down at her hands, still dirty, now resting on her worn dress. The monster in her stomach was quiet. The whole world was quiet. And in that quiet, she was terrified of what would happen next. For 10 long seconds, the silence in the restaurant was complete. It was a heavy breathing thing, a shared moment of awe that no one wanted to shatter. The little girl on the piano bench sat perfectly still, her head bowed, her hands limp in her lap. She felt the silence like a physical weight, and the fear that had been pushed away by the music began to creep back in. What now? Would they still laugh? Would they just point her back to the door? She had given them everything she had, and now she was empty. Waiting for a judgment, it was the old man who broke the spell. He slowly pushed his chair back, the small scrape of its legs on the wooden floor sounding like a crack of thunder in the quiet room. He got to his feet, his aged body moving with a slow deliberation. He did not clap. He simply stood there, his hands resting on the back of his chair, and looked at the little girl with an expression of profound respect. That was all it took. His simple act of standing was a signal, a permission, and the dam of silence burst. It wasn't a polite smattering of applause. It was an explosion. A man at a nearby table shot to his feet, his hands coming together in a loud, enthusiastic clap. Then another person stood, and another. A wave of movement rippled through the dining room as person after person rose from their seat. The applause started as a few scattered claps, but it quickly grew into a deafening, thunderous roar that filled the restaurant. Sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. People were not just clapping. They were shouting bravo. an encore. Their faces, which had been filled with skepticism and amusement just minutes before, were now flushed with emotion, their eyes shining with tears. The little girl flinched at the sudden noise, her head snapping up. Her wide, tear-filled eyes scanned the room, and what she saw made no sense to her. The entire restaurant was on its feet. The people who had laughed at her were now cheering for her. The woman who had been feeding her baby was wiping away tears with the back of her hand, a huge, beautiful smile on her face. The table of businessmen was clapping so hard the man's hands must have stung, his face a picture of pure astonishment. The maître d' stood by the door, his jaw slightly slack, his hands clapping along with everyone else, a look of what could only be described as wonder on his face. They were not just applauding a performance, they were applauding a miracle. They were applauding the unexpected, the impossible beauty that had just unfolded before them. They were cheering for the little girl who had dared to ask for food with the only currency she had, her soul. And in that moment, the currency had proven to be priceless. The sound was overwhelming. It was so loud, so full of warmth, that it felt like a physical touch. The little girl, who had spent her life being ignored and unseen, was now the center of a storm of positive energy. The fear inside her, which had been a cold, hard knot, began to dissolve, replaced by a new, shocking feeling. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of being understood. Fresh tears streamed down her face, but these were not tears of shame or hunger. They were tears of release, of pure, overwhelming emotion. She didn't know what to do. She had never been applauded before. She just sat there, a small crying child on a giant piano bench. As the room erupted for her, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure emerge from the kitchen. It was the chef, a big, burly man with a wild-looking mustache and a stained white apron. He held a large white porcelain plate in his hands, and on that plate was a mountain of food. There was a twist of golden spaghetti covered in a rich red sauce, a large juicy meatball, and 2 thick slices of garlic bread, golden and glistening with butter. It was more food than she had ever seen in one place in her entire life. The smell of it hit her, and her stomach, which had been quiet during the music, let out a loud, embarrassing rumble that only she seemed to hear. The chef walked slowly toward her, his usually gruff expression replaced by one of tenderness. The crowd's applause softened as people watched him approach. He didn't say a word. He just walked right up to the piano, carefully leaned over the keys, and placed the plate on the music stand. The plate was still warm, and the heat from it warmed her cheeks. He looked down at her, his eyes soft, and gave her a slow, gentle nod. It was a look that said, "You earned this." Then he turned and walked back to his kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging doors. The little girl just stared at the food. It was so beautiful it looked like something from a dream. She could see the steam rising from the sauce, the little flecks of green basil in it. She could smell the garlic and the warm bread. Her small hands trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. She reached out a hesitant finger and touched the side of the plate. It was real. It was really for her. As the applause began to die down, a new sound emerged. A single, distinct clink. A woman, elegant in a simple black dress, had tapped a spoon against her wine glass. She caught the attention of the room, and with a tearful smile called out, "Someone get that girl a fork." A young waiter rushed over, not with a simple fork, but with a whole set of polished silverware wrapped in a clean linen napkin. Another person brought a small glass of water. A moment later, the old man who had saved her from the door walked over and stood beside the piano. He moved slowly, leaning slightly on a cane she hadn't noticed before. He looked at the plate of food, and then at her. "Eat, child," he said, his voice gentle and kind. "You must be hungry." She didn't need to be told twice. With a gratefulness that was almost painful, she picked up the fork. Her hand was still shaking, but she managed to spear a small twist of the spaghetti. She brought it to her mouth, and the moment the warm, rich sauce touched her tongue, a new wave of tears came. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was not just food. It was acceptance. It was warmth. It was love. She ate with a focused intensity, not like a lady in a restaurant, but like a hungry child who had been starving. She didn't care that people were watching. She didn't care about anything except the glorious, life-giving taste of the meal. She ate every last strand of pasta, every bit of the meatball, and sopped up the remaining sauce with the garlic bread until the plate was clean. When she was done, she leaned back, a feeling of pure contentment spreading through her body. The monster in her stomach was finally silent. For the first time in a very long time, she was full. The old man waited patiently until she was finished. He then pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat down beside her. He was close, but not too close, giving her space. "My name is Arthur," he said simply. He didn't ask for hers. He just offered his own. She looked at him, her eyes clear and bright. "I'm Alara," she whispered. It was a name she had not spoken out loud in a long time. "Alara," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "It's a beautiful name," Arthur continued, his voice soft and calm. "That music you played, where did you learn to play like that?" Alara looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. I don't know," she said honestly. "My mom used to hum. I just remember it. And I add other things." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes full of understanding. "You have a gift, Alara," he said. "A very special gift. It is not something to be hidden in alleyways. It is something to be shared with the world." He then looked around the restaurant, which was slowly returning to a state of quiet normalcy. Though the atmosphere was completely different, people were talking in hushed, excited tones, and many kept glancing over at the piano bench with smiles. "I was a teacher of music for many years," Arthur said, his gaze returning to her. "A long time ago? I recognize raw, untaught talent when I hear it. What you did tonight? It was not just playing. It was storytelling. It was more important than anything else that has happened in this city all year." Alara just looked at him, unsure of what to say. Arthur leaned forward a little, his voice even lower. "You cannot go back to the streets, Alara. A gift like yours would die there, and the world would be poorer for it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I know some people. People who help children. Children who have a talent but no opportunity. There is a school, a special place for young musicians. It is a very good school. If you would let me, I would like to make a phone call for you. On your behalf." He wasn't asking her to trust him with her life in a vague way. He was offering a concrete, tangible step forward. He was offering a door. Alara stared at him, her heart pounding. It was too much. A full stomach, applause, and now this? It felt like a dream, and she was afraid that if she blinked, she would wake up back in the cold alley, the taste of spaghetti, just a memory. She looked at Arthur's kind, wrinkled face, at his clear, honest eyes. She saw no pity there, only a genuine belief in her. She thought of the music, how it had felt to let it out. She thought of the feeling of the warm food in her belly, and she made a choice. She gave a small, hesitant nod. A slow, warm smile spread across Arthur's face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old-fashioned flip phone. Alara watched as he scrolled through the contacts, his finger moving slowly over the small screen. He pressed a button and held the phone to his ear. The room seemed to fade away again. All she could hear was the sound of her own heart, and Arthur's quiet voice as he spoke into the phone. "Yes, hello. It's Arthur. I apologize for the late hour. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I've just heard something. Something extraordinary. No, I am quite certain. I am sitting with her now. It is a girl. Yes, just a little thing. But her talent? It is beyond anything I have ever heard. She must be heard. I think. Yes, I believe she would be a perfect fit for the scholarship program. Could she possibly come for an audition? Tomorrow? Yes, I will bring her myself. Thank you. Thank you so much." He snapped the phone shut and looked at Alara, his eyes twinkling. "Be ready in the morning, little musician. We have an audition to attend." The ride in Arthur's car was a world away from the cold, open air of the streets. The seats were soft, old leather that smelled faintly of old books, and something minty. For the first time in her life, Ilara was inside a car, moving through the city not as a pedestrian, but as a passenger. The streetlights and headlights blurred into streaks of color outside the window, like a watercolor painting. Arthur had insisted on stopping at a small, quiet shop that sold warm clothes. He didn't ask, he just bought. He chose a sturdy warm coat in a deep green color, a pair of jeans that actually fit, new shoes that were not for Sundays, but for every day, and a soft sweater the color of cream. Ilara felt awkward and undeserving, but Arthur just smiled as if it were the most normal thing in the world. A musician must be comfortable to play her best, he had said, his matter-of-fact tone leaving no room for argument. That night, she didn't sleep in an alley. Arthur had taken her to a small, tidy guest room in his apartment, a room filled with books and lined with shelves of old vinyl records. She slept in a real bed under a warm quilt, and for the first time, the dreams that came were not of hunger, but of melodies. The next morning, the building they approached for the audition was not like anything Ilara had ever seen. It was old and grand, made of dark stone with tall, arched windows that looked like eyes. A sign above the heavy wooden doors read, "The Harmony Academy for Young Artists." Ilara's stomach, which had been calm and full for the first time in years, began to twist itself into knots again. Her new clothes felt stiff and foreign on her body. She felt like a fraud, an alley cat dressed up to pretend she belonged in a palace. She clutched Arthur's hand, his gnarled, warm fingers, a grounding force in her rising panic. "It's all right, little one," Arthur said softly, sensing her fear. "Just play them what you've played for me. Play them what you feel. That is all you need." Inside, the air was still and filled with a faint, echoing silence. It smelled of wood polish and old paper, a smell of serious work and dedication. A woman with a kind face and glasses perched on her nose led them down a long hallway lined with photographs of stern-looking men and women holding instruments. They stopped outside a pair of large oak doors. The woman gave Ilara a reassuring smile. "They are ready for you." Arthur squeezed her hand one last time, then let go. "I will be right here when you are finished," he whispered. Eller pushed the door open. The room was vast, with a high ceiling and dark wood paneling that soaked up the light. Seated at a long table in the center of the room were three people. A stern woman with her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. A man with a gentle, sleepy-looking face who kept his eyes half closed. A younger man with an intense, energetic expression. They were the panel, the judges. In the corner of the room, gleaming under the light from a large window, sat a grand piano, even more beautiful than the one in the restaurant. They looked at her as she walked in, their eyes appraising. She was just a little girl, small for her age. Looking overwhelmed in a room that was too big for her, "State your name and the piece you will be playing," stern woman said, her voice sharp and formal. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice barely a squeak. "And I don't know the name of the piece. I just made it up." The stern woman's eyebrow arched, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. The man with the sleepy expression opened his eyes a little wider, intrigued. "You composed it yourself?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Ilara just nodded, too nervous to speak. She walked over to the piano and climbed onto the bench. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. The faces of the three judges felt like a wall of doubt. They were expecting something from her, something polished, something learned. But all she had was the music from her heart. She was just a hungry little girl from an alley. Who was she to be here? She placed her fingers on the keys just as she had the night before. For a moment she couldn't move. The fear had frozen her. She thought of the laughter in the restaurant, of the shame, and then she thought of Arthur's kind eyes. She closed her own eyes and took a deep breath. She shut out the judges, the room, the expectations. She went back to the alley. She felt the cold, the damp, the loneliness, and then she felt the music. The one thing that was always hers. She let it fill her up until it pushed the fear away. She began to play. She started with the same simple, hopeful melody from the night before. The sound immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. The stiff air seemed to soften, too warm. The stern woman's posture relaxed by a fraction. The man with the intense expression leaned forward, his elbows on the table, completely captivated. Just like the night before, the music began to grow. It wove in the sad, lonely notes the story of the cold and the hunger. It was not a technically perfect performance. There were small hesitations, a slightly rushed chord, but it was so full of raw, honest emotion that it didn't matter. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. She played of watching families through a window, of the pain of being an outsider. She played of the courage it took to open that heavy door, and the shame of being laughed at. The music swelled into the storm, the chaotic, powerful part that told of the city's harshness and her own fierce will to survive. The three judges sat utterly motionless. The stern woman had a hand pressed to her chest as if to hold her own heart in place. The sleepy man was now wide awake, his eyes glistening. The intense man was smiling a wide, brilliant smile, nodding his head in time with the music, lost in the sheer, unadulterated talent of it all. They weren't hearing a child playing a song anymore. They were hearing a life story, told in the most beautiful language in the world. When she finished, her hands dropped to her lap, and the final chord faded into the silence of the great room. This time the silence was not one of shock, but of reverence. No one moved for a long time. The only sound was Ilara's own quiet breathing. She kept her eyes closed, bracing for the judgment. Finally, she heard a soft sound. It was the man with the gentle, sleepy face. He was clapping, slowly and deliberately. The intense man joined in, his clapping sharp and enthusiastic. Even the stern woman was clapping, a slow, respectful rhythm that was more meaningful than any roar. Ilara opened her eyes. The stern woman stood up. "Ilara," she said, and her voice was no longer sharp, but filled with a quiet awe. "What you just did, what you just gave us, was more important than any perfect scale any student has ever played here. We would be honored to have you as a student at the Harmony Academy on a full scholarship. Starting today." Life changed after that day. The academy became her new world. It was a world of practice rooms, of music theory classes that were difficult but fascinating, and of other children who, like her, lived and breathed music. She still felt different, still a little like an outsider, but for the first time her difference was celebrated. She wasn't a weird kid who made up songs. She was a composer. She wasn't a lonely girl. She was a prodigy. Years passed. The little girl from the alley grew. Her hands, once small and grimy, became long and elegant, capable of coaxing sounds from a piano that could make a whole audience weep. She learned to read the complex language of music on a page, but she never forgot the language of the heart, the music that lived inside her. Her compositions became more complex, more structured, but they never lost their raw, emotional core. They still told stories of cold and warmth, of hunger and belonging, of darkness and a single, defiant note of hope. One evening many years later, a young woman walked onto the stage of a grand concert hall. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, and her hair was pulled back neatly. The hall was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. On the program, her name was printed in elegant letters, Ilara. She sat at the gleaming concert grand, the same kind of instrument that had once seemed so far away. She looked out at the sea of faces, all looking back at her. For a brief moment, she wasn't a celebrated composer or a world-class pianist. She was a little girl again, looking through a steamy window. But this time, she was not on the outside. This was her room. These were her people. She closed her eyes and her fingers found the keys. The first note she played was clear and pure, like a drop of clean water in a dusty room. It was the same melody she had played that night in the restaurant, the one born of hunger and loneliness. But as she played it now, in this warm, crowded hall, surrounded by people who were there just to hear her, the melody was no longer sad. It was no longer a story of what she had lost. It was a celebration of everything she had found. It was the sound of a full stomach, of a warm bed, of a kind old man's belief. It was the sound of a new song, a song that had finally found its home.